I know I've been saying a lot lately that this was the craziest alternate scenario I'd ever created. But this time, for real, it is the craziest and most unrealistic story I've ever created. Because today, in order to celebrate having surpassed 20,000 subscribers, 25,000 at the time of writing this video, I'm going to put myself in a unique, fantastical, completely mind-blowing, and perhaps a little embarrassing situation and context, but I'll try to make it as non-cringe as possible. Often in my stories, I propose many solutions and ideas to prevent the most tragic moments of Roman history, having, I admit, a very different and original perspective on the matter compared to other content creators in this niche. But this time, I'm going to put myself in a situation where I'll have to take charge of applying those solutions and ideas myself in this alternate scenario that is, what if I became a Roman emperor? That's the alternate scenario we're going to see today. Can I improve Rome's fate and prevent its worst tragedies? Or at least be a decent emperor? Will I be able to improve and extend the Pax Romana, or on the contrary, will I ruin everything before its original downfall anyway? We'll see all that and more below. So, first and foremost, and as always, let's start by putting in place all the details needed to kick off this story. When would I be teleported back in time to become emperor? Simple, in August 117 CE. That was the moment Trajan died in our original timeline. Again, I want to make this clear, and I hope that this time, contrary to the last time when I insisted on this many times, you will understand that all of this is absolutely not realistic at all, but here is the approach of how it would all start. One day, around this time, I would be magically teleported instantly back in time to August 117 CE, just as Trajan would die at that time. Aside from this magical phenomenon of my arrival in the past, Trajan's testament would also change the person who inherited his position as emperor. Instead of being his cousin Hadrian, it would be me, a complete stranger. Again, this is just for entertainment and fun. It is, of course, completely unrealistic. Without further ado, once the Roman Senate approved Trajan's last wishes, I would be declared the new emperor, or the new princeps. Trajan's words would be incontestable, and being considered the best of the emperors that Rome ever had, and being deeply loved by all, both by the people and by the Senate, no one would question my succession, although they would find it very strange, but at the beginning they would fully support me. However, if over time I do not live up to my position, the approval and support that I could receive could decrease until they even want to assassinate me, as was very common at that time, so I could not relax at any time despite the initial approval. Now, the next question is, how long would I have to be emperor? How long would I live? Of course, this is all very hypothetical, and it's very hard to know because, well, I'm not dead yet. But based on the life expectancy of my relatives who already died in real life, I can give myself an average life expectancy of around 83 years. Taking that into account, and assuming I die of natural causes at the age of 83, that would be in the year 175 CE, since by 117 CE, I would be only 25 years old, which is my current age in real life. It may sound a bit crazy, but that life expectancy for an emperor was not that far-fetched. Augustus, Anastasius I, or even Justinian, who, by the way, suffered from the Justinian plague and survived that same plague, and many other examples lived to that age range, proving that it was more than possible. That would mean my reign as emperor would last 58 long years. The longest reign of any emperor the empire has ever had, longer than even Augustus and his 40 years of reign. Now, in terms of languages, how can I communicate with them? Well, in that regard, although it may surprise you, I'm not too worried. Firstly, I'm fluent in 3 languages, 2 of them Romance, and 1 of them highly influenced by Latin for its vocabulary, which are French, Spanish, and English. But I also have a relatively solid foundation in Italian, and even more importantly, classical Latin. Because yes, for those who didn't know, I've actually been learning classical Latin by myself for almost 2 years now whenever I can, and in that regard, I've made enormous progress, so much so that I actually speak Latin better than Italian, just to give you an idea. I'm not yet at a level of fluency, not even close, but I'm much closer to fluency than to complete ignorance of that language. So that you understand my true level of Latin, I will try to illustrate this with the best examples I have. I'm going to illustrate the evolution of my Latin by comparing it with my evolution in learning English. For those of you who are native English speakers, this may not sound familiar, but for those of you who, like me, learned English as a second or even third language, I think you'll perfectly understand what I'm talking about. I started to take the idea of learning English seriously, albeit subconsciously, at the age of 17. 3 years later, when I was 20, I had a level sufficient to communicate at a basic level in English and understand at a very advanced level what native English speakers were saying to me. But even though technically my understanding and comprehension of English was already approaching a certain level of fluency, I still wasn't able to express myself and speak with the same fluency as I did in my mind in that language. I was still blocked. There was a learning wall that I couldn't overcome no matter how much I practiced. And that wall I couldn't overcome, I would never have been able to overcome it, not even in 10 more years of practicing the language on my own, for one simple reason: there's only one way to overcome it. And that way is to go live in a place for a few months, ideally longer, where you can only speak English. You have to force yourself to be confronted with only speaking, writing, reading, thinking, and even sleeping in English 24 hours and 7 days non-stop. And then suddenly that wall would break down in a very short time, as I said, just a few months. And everything I'd learned in the previous 3 years seemed suddenly like nothing compared to everything I'd learned in 6 months of speaking English all the time. I learned more in those 6 months of my life than I did in 3 years of practicing the language on my own with only internet access. And it was there that I finally reached a certain level of fluency and understanding in the language, as you can hear today. We never become completely fluent in the most literal sense of the word, of course. Heck, even in my native language, I keep learning new words that I didn't know until now. It's a process that never completely ends, but at least it's more than enough to have basic conversations or extremely advanced and complex ones with anyone who speaks that same language. Where am I going with all of this? Well, that famous wall I told you about, which I couldn't overcome until I spent months speaking only English, is that same wall that now is blocking me from reaching a certain level of fluency in Latin. And sadly, unlike English, where there are many places in the world where you can go to learn it in your daily life, there is currently no country on the planet where people live who speak it as their native language.
Classical Latin.
Therefore, if I were teleported back in time to ancient Rome, I would have little to no trouble communicating at a basic level from the start with all the Latin speakers in the empire, and in just a few months of being forced and confronted with only having the choice to speak, read, write, and think in Latin 24/7 non-stop, I am absolutely confident that I would reach a very high level of fluency in that language. Of course, all of that would only apply to Latin in the case of Greek, since I had not yet seriously begun my attempt to learn the language, both its ancient and modern versions. It would take me much longer to master the language, probably many years, which I think would make me severely criticized and mocked by Roman high society, who considered it normal for someone of my status to know how to speak both official languages of the empire. Having clarified my communication skills with them, which would not be such a difficult barrier to overcome as expected thanks to my linguistic knowledge prior to having returned to the past, what could I contribute to them and their empire as their emperor? Well, for starters, like many of my generation, I don't have the physical or military aptitude to lead the empire in a conqueror or general sense, so I would be more of a centralized administrator than a military expansionist. Think of my way of leading the empire as being closer to that of men like Augustus, Claudius, or Justinian, to give a few well-known examples of great leaders who were completely alien to the military world. What I would contribute to the empire would be, more than anything, as you can imagine, my knowledge of the future. To start with, my vast and extensive knowledge of Greco-Roman history, which is not nothing to start with. Of course, those insights and foresight abilities wouldn't be as great or developed as having some sort of precognitive superpower like I did recently in my video of if Justinian could see the future, but it would still be an invaluable asset to my quest to extend the empire's long-term prosperity. But in particular, my advantage would lie in the era in which I would have landed in the past, because like many of you I'm sure, when I began to learn about Roman history, the first era in which I became deeply interested was the Pax Romana of its history. And even if later I became interested in learning more than just that period, as the good Romaboo that I am, and as Dovahati said in his unbiased History of Rome series, just after Trajan conquered Parthia,
it's all downhill from here.
Therefore, although I eventually expanded my knowledge of Roman history beyond its golden age, I always had a fascination and great interest in knowing everything about that period, because if there is an era that must be analyzed to know how far Rome would have come if it had survived, it's definitely its Pax Romana. In order to illustrate my understanding and knowledge of Roman history, you have to see it as a gradient, one that becomes more and more blurred the further back or further ahead we go from the Pax Romana. That in itself would be of enormous help for the future of Rome for which I want to prepare it, but my knowledge is not limited to my historical knowledge only. It goes far beyond than that, and not just me, but all of you who are watching me right now. We underestimate a lot the amount of generalized knowledge that any of us have normalized in our minds today, which in Roman times would have seemed like ideas or innovations coming from a genius. It's the kind of widespread knowledge that we no longer know how to appreciate and value today because our minds are so overwhelmed and brain-rotten by all the modern distractions. These same modern distractions prevent us from realizing the true potential of our generalized knowledge at a basic level. But if we were suddenly freed from these modern distractions that are brain-rotting our brains and attention spans and had only our thoughts for company, we would quickly realize how much we know as an average person from our time compared to a highly educated person from Roman times. And that wouldn't be because we're smarter than them. No, not at all. All of that is due to the fact that we come from a long line of geniuses who revolutionized the knowledge and innovations of their own time, which eventually allowed their innovative and unique ideas to become, over the centuries and future generations, standardized and widespread knowledge among even the less intellectually educated and fortunate population. For example, although none of us would probably know how to build a car, we all know more or less the parts, tools, and materials needed to build a car, which is far more than any Roman could imagine to begin with. But even if we were less ambitious, if we wanted to, we could easily implement the invention of the printing press in ancient times, at least a primitive one as it worked at the beginning of the Renaissance. We don't literally know how to make it, but we all have a general idea of what it would take to build a primitive printing press. It is with that kind of perspective that we could guide the engineers and greatest minds of ancient Rome, so that based on our ideas, they would have the inspiration and the spark to carry them out thanks to their objectively superior IQ to ours. And each of us has our own general knowledge at an individual level. For example, in my case, I don't know what they teach you in Anglo-Saxon countries.
Where is Europe?
Don't know.
But back in elementary school, I remember being taught how to make a homemade battery with very simple materials and basically generate electricity on my own. Let's imagine that I present this invention of mine to Roman engineers. At first glance, it might seem like an interesting and funny toy, similar to Heron of Alexandria's Aeolipile, but nothing more than that. But thanks to my hindsight that people like Herons wouldn't have, I could explain the possibilities of that idea and the generation of power and electricity on a large scale for other more complex and advanced machinery necessary for maintaining different aspects of a civilization. And thanks to my explanations, those engineers and geniuses of the empire would suddenly have a spark that would ignite, no, explode in their minds, immediately having the inspiration to implement that fun toy I made in multiple inventions much more useful in different fields. And unlike me, those people would have the IQ and creativity necessary to implement those inventions thanks to the futuristic perspective and hindsight I would have given them on the potential of those innovations. That's basically what I meant when I said that we vastly underestimate the general knowledge we have today. I'm not a genius with a deep understanding of mechanics, engineering, or even agriculture, but I have generalized knowledge and basic ideas in my mind that, if explained well, could ignite the spark in the brilliant minds of Rome to realize those ideas decades, centuries, or millennia ahead of schedule. And in that regard, I'm also very fortunate because the Pax Romana is the period where the greatest number of geniuses and engineers specialized in different fields could contribute to that revolution of innovations that I could bring them. With all these explanations, I want to show you that I do not pretend or think that I am smarter than you with the ideas and reforms that I would contribute to the Roman Empire following all of this, but only that I want to remind you how much any average modern man knows compared to Romans in antiquity, although we often do not think about it too much due to how overwhelmed and brain-rotten we are in this depressive and retarded world, especially since 2020, as all my Gen Z comrades sadly know so well. With all of that, I think it's time to get started with the current scenario of this crazy alternate story of me being the Roman emperor after Trajan's reign. And remember, if this scenario doesn't have a specific or clear order, don't take it too seriously. This is just for fun and entertainment. I hope it reminds you that none of this is realistic at all. So, first of all, the first thing I would do upon becoming emperor and finally being established in the Roman government would be to do exactly the same thing that Hadrian did in our timeline, that is, completely abandon the province of Mesopotamia, which was too difficult and expensive to control at that moment. It was undoubtedly a very intelligent and rational action for Hadrian to do, and if even after almost 2,000 years of hindsight, it still seems like the most logical decision to make, then it was undoubtedly the correct decision objectively, Simply put, the empire was not yet ready for such an overexpansion. And to be honest, if it were up to me, I would also abandon Dacia and even Britain, but that would be considered a disgrace, a sign of weakness, and a profound disrespect for the legacy of Trajan and Claudius, respectively. And as I told you before, although my rise to power would be incontestable and completely accepted for the purposes of this scenario, that does not mean that in the future the Senate or the people could not turn against me for the decisions I might take. And definitely, abandoning Dacia and Britain would be more than enough reasons not only to delegitimize my position as emperor, but probably to have me assassinated. So for the time being, I'll have to accept dealing with the empire's overreach, which only I could understand as a problem thanks to my hindsight, and do my best to compensate for that problem in the short term. The second thing I would do would be to begin the construction of Hadrian's Wall as soon as possible. In our timeline, the wall took 6 years to be completed, so if it were to begin, for example, in 118 CE, it would be done by 124 CE. For the moment, by not being able to abandon Britain, this remains the best solution for the time being to ensure the island's prosperity against its direct enemies, the Caledonian barbarians. Following that alternate Hadrian's Wall, which in this timeline would probably bear my name, the third thing I would do would be to initiate a series of long-term projects for very long walls along all the most important and vulnerable borders of the empire. These wall projects would take decades to complete, but starting them now would provide a huge long-term advantage for the empire. But of course, thanks to my hindsight, I would know the exact areas and points where it would be most urgent to begin these walls, such as the northern part of the Danube, which was very important for the Marcomannic Wars that were to take place in a few decades. But eventually, all the vulnerable borders of the empire would be covered by a series of impressive walls, comparable to the Chinese walls, built on the borders of the Danube, as I said, but also the Rhine, the Levant, and Armenia. If these wall constructions proceed at a pace similar to the construction of Hadrian's Wall, by the end of my reign, the empire would have all its vulnerable borders completely ready for reinforced defense, giving them a gigantic advantage to mobilize fewer troops in specific areas in times of crisis to defend their borders. I would also take the opportunity with those walls to implement new road networks, watchtowers, signal fires, and early communication relays with optical signals, similar to what the Eastern Romans would do later in our history with the Eastern Roman beacon system used during the Middle Ages. While all of those projects would be carried out for the long term, the fourth thing I would do would be to implement the creation of the printing press right away. Initially, I would tell them to use woodcut block printing as an early stage, train scribes and artisans in movable metal type, build a papyrus or parchment mass production chain in a cheap, standardized format, and of course, create an imperial printing guild for regulation and training. I'm pretty sure that with all my recommendations, ideas, and advice on how to make them, brighter minds than I in the empire would quickly come up with results similar to the first printing presses that were invented in the 15th century in our original timeline. Once the printing press would be created, standardized, and expanded to all the major and important areas of the empire, the fifth thing I would do would be the project of funding standardized universities and public schools for free. I would start small at first, focusing on the largest and most important cities of the empire, such as Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, Carthage, or Athens. Thanks to the creation of the printing press, the dissemination of basic knowledge could reach all classes of citizens much more easily and quickly, allowing for the institutionalization and standardization of basic knowledge to be delivered in public schools accessible to the youth anywhere in the empire where such institutions were located. Meanwhile, universities could share their knowledge and discoveries massively throughout the empire thanks to the publishing capacity they would have with the printing press. In the long term, this would create new generations of literate Romans who would be able to speak Latin or Greek in absolutely any part of the empire, linguistically unifying the different peoples who inhabit the empire and its vast territory. Following this, to revolutionize the world of mathematics, I would introduce the Indian number system to the Roman intellectual elites, showing them its superiority over Roman numerals with, for example, faster calculations, building ratios, geometry, and much more that I could teach them, although of course very limited, because personally I was never very good with advanced mathematics, but I have no doubt that once shown the few basics that I know, geniuses of the empire, much smarter and more creative than me, could take advantage of that incredible and revolutionary innovation to push their ideas and innovations far beyond what they could have ever imagined before. As a result of all this, it would also facilitate starting the spark of an early scientific revolution through sponsored innovations. All of this would be implemented in a more rustic and simplified version of the original ideas due to my limited knowledge of the subjects, but as a general rule, I would put back the interest and focus of the Roman geniuses in things like the Eolipile of Heron of Alexandria, pushing the idea of continuous rotation, and early steam engine prototypes with a lot of experimentation that would just bring efficient and good reasons probably way after my reign, but that wouldn't matter for me knowing the results in the long term. Also, I would be pushing towards hydraulics, like water turbines, automated grain mills, and irrigation networks. I would begin experiments with gunpowder, pushing towards the founding of early alchemical labs, recommending them to experiment with things like using saltpeter from India, sulfur, and charcoal, which are the only things I know about how the first tests of using gunpowder were made in our timeline. Again, I wouldn't expect to see results during my lifetime as emperor, but I would know that in the long run, innovation would surely yield to surprising discoveries far ahead of their time, which was all that mattered to me. Also, as I mentioned previously, I would use my knowledge of how to create homemade turbines and electric batteries to introduce them to the potential that this energy source could have in the future, inspiring many Roman engineers and mathematicians to experiment in a much more advanced way than I will ever be able to. In the area of agriculture, I would implement the three-field farming system, boosting food supply, preparing it for an urban population boom, creating several reforms in order to improve the distribution of the population throughout the empire in sparsely urbanized and inhabited areas, to relieve the most overcrowded and difficult to maintain urban centers due to the high population density that had to be fed in those areas, as was the case with the city of Rome itself. Also, thanks to the now great ease of disseminating information throughout the empire thanks to the printing press and the universities, I would initiate major reforms regarding healthcare and hygiene knowledge. I would mandate soap production and distribution, build communal taps and vertical showers in insulae, similar to modern Italian showers, in order to at least give access in the big cities to the inhabitants of the insulae at bare minimum one shower per building, because yes, for those who didn't know, the Romans had taps. Also, I would teach them basic germ theory proxies with illustrated pamphlets via printing press. Create imperial medical offices in every major city for launching plague protocols, isolation, sanitation, air circulation, early quarantine, and more. This would hopefully in time, especially in the long run, increase lifespan, lower mortality, higher military readiness. And with a ton of luck, most of those reforms could be normalized across most of the urban centers of the empire by the time the Antonine Plague arrives. Continuing with the list of things I would do, the Anglo-Saxons watching me won't like that part at all, but we are literally talking about me being emperor, and that's what I would do. I'm not going to hide or lie about who I am. So sorry if you don't like it. But the next thing would be stopping Christianity's rise via philosophy, satire, and debate. For those who didn't know, public debates and places like forums were very popular among the lower classes, supported and encouraged by philosophers and other intellectuals of the empire. But one of those debates that was forbidden was Christianity, with Christians not allowed to participate, and that, despite the fact that, as my colleague, Unreal History, told me, pagan philosophers were literally lining up to debate with Christian philosophers all the time. Many were quite confident that the Christian religion was a hollow and would be easily defeated, which I find very likely, only if they were allowed to be humiliated in public by debating with based pagans, which sadly was not the case. Philosophy back then was quite a bit more competitive than what we're used to thinking of things now. Fewer avenues overall, for social merit after all, no social media, and more. Except this time, they would have the printing press as a tool of propaganda and mind-changing of the opinion and understanding of the masses. And the Christian population at the time was quite small, whereas the opposing philosophers were probably more populous than the entire population of early Christendom. It's our belief, the belief of me and that of Unreal History, that if they were allowed to debate, the major pagan philosophers of the early Roman Empire would have been able to relegate Christianity to a simple, anti-government death cult whose foundations are built on sand, nothing more than a joke, like Judaism was seen at that time too. And if I opened up the printing press to pagan philosophy but did not allow the Christians access to it, or at least with a lot of restrictions, then yeah, It would allow paganism and pagan philosophical ideals to very quickly outstrip Christianity from any kind of credibility or legitimacy. That's just ultimately generic propaganda rules. The one who can mass produce and distribute his content the fastest and over the widest area will inevitably succeed in all the debates and political battles ever. So I won't only invite them to debate Christians, I would also hold well-recorded theological debates, record all the smashing victories wherein Christians concede, mass produce those transcripts and send them to all ends of the empire. Christianity will end up losing out because it is shown on all ends of the empire exactly how little it could defend or justify itself as recorded during said debates. Christianity won't completely disappear with all of that sadly, but probably, like Judaism in our timeline, it'll stay around until the modern day as some backwater cringy cult that nobody really cares about but accepts it, exists as the foundation of a far-flung people group that forms a tiny minority of the empire. Continuing with the things to do, the next thing I would focus on would be the economy, knowing fully well how fragile and ephemeral the empire's economic situation was in the long term, with the multiple economic crises it would suffer in the future, combined with a gigantic inflation that we would not see again until the 2020s in our reality. I would start with a massive investment in agricultural reforms for grain supply, with the Cura Annoni being supercharged with those innovations and previous agricultural reforms I mentioned before that would have massively increased the production of food across the empire. I would introduce mechanical seeders, water wheels, granaries with ventilation, build imperial grain reserves in every province, apply crop rotation 3-field system to keep soil fertile, as I said before, and promote imperial agrarian schools for rural populations to teach them new techniques of farming and managing agricultural lands. Apart from all this, another important point that would interest me would be to reform the situation and management of slaves in the empire. It would be a bit idealistic, sure, but feasible when linked to innovation. I would first implement the reforms that Antoninus Pius did in our timeline. Enact slave protection laws, prohibit mass cruelty or public executions, regulate slave-to-machine ratios, which means that if a task can be done more efficiently by machine and new technologies, then in consequence, you must reduce slave labor in that specific field. With that, slavery would begin a gradual economic obsolescence, and with time, a lot of time, probably decades after my death, it would create a proto-middle class of freedmen, artisans, and engineers. Above all, another thing I would reform would be the banking system of ancient Rome and the implementation of a modernized credit system. I would create an imperial financial guilds with chartered offices and legalize credit and investment contracts with interest, although usury limits may need to be abolished or modified if that would be the case. Found imperial development banks offering loans to citizens for approved projects, farms, ships, inventions, schools, and much more. And I would also establish courts to enforce loan repayment laws in order to prevent as much as possible any attempt at corruption in that sector and in the new system that I would be implementing. I would essentially formalize and centralize this under state supervision. Resistance from traditional elites may occur if I empower too many new rich people, but I think it would be manageable with the right legal framework. Among other important but less urgent topics, I would also try to revolutionize basic physics knowledge with public demonstrations to entertain people at my appearances. I would introduce the basics of Newtonian physics in public like gravity, air resistance, and more if I'm capable of doing it. I would set up imperial lecture demonstrations in public forums and schools, use tools like feathers, rocks, water pressure, lever balances, explain laws of motion, inertia, air resistance, and basic mechanics, and I would try to frame it under Stoic natural law to make it palatable for educated Romans and the average mentality and understanding of the world at that time. I'm pretty sure Romans loved public oratory and philosophical demonstration. Many wouldn't grasp abstract theory, but they would be amazed by demonstrations of falling objects or pendulums. This could seed an early mechanical tradition even if we are very optimistic. Another less urgent thing, but one that I could implement, would be to promote artistic innovation. By that I mean developing 3D perspective in art, realism, and new visual techniques. Sponsoring an imperial art academy in Rome, Alexandria, and Athens, and other big cities of the empire with time. I would recruit for that the best painters, mosaicists, and sculptors in the empire and introduce them to geometric perspective by teaching basic optics and vanishing point ideas derived from Euclidean geometry, which the Greeks already had. Thankfully, that would be a field in which I could help and contribute a lot, thanks to having some artistic aptitudes and skills myself, not enough to be a great Renaissance artist or painter, but enough to teach them the basics of volume and perspectives that could be added to a painting for more realism and detail for artists much more talented than me, using painted ceiling illusions, relief sculptures, and mosaic depth effects to experiment with visual perception. And then I would commission imperial artworks that I would use to glorify my reign and the beauty of the magnificent empire we would all be part of, expressing in those commissioned paintines letters of love from me towards all Romans and the achievements of our ancestors. I think this is a very realistic goal. Roman and Hellenistic art already lean toward realism, and with state sponsorship and a few key theoretical breakthroughs inspired by my inputs, things like Brunelleschi-style perspective could appear almost a millennium and a half early. Taking advantage of the artistic revolution I would promote, I would also revolutionize the techniques of mapping and conceiving the world and how to picture it. I would introduce bird's-eye view maps, precise imperial cartography, and even rough maps of America and Australia, or like Romans would call it, Terra Australis, all of those maps being drawn by myself, of course. And as someone who literally makes a daily routine of drawing maps and borders of the Roman Empire and other great neighboring empires, at this point I practically know by heart the borders of the Roman Empire in every era and the contours of important rivers in Europe and other parts of the world. It would not be extremely accurate or as geometrically perfect as Mercator's map, but it would still be a gigantic advance for the Romans' mapping and understanding of the world and of their own empire and its approximate borders. I know this is hard for us to understand or imagine, but at that time, the first thing that ancient humans pictured in their minds when you asked them about the world or a specific geographical area was not an image seen from the sky, like a bird's point of view, but rather a simplified line of advances to specific points that they had as a reference to remember the places they came from, but nothing more. Conceptualizing the world from a satellite perspective, so to speak, would be fascinating, revolutionary, and perhaps even scary for some, as they would truly appreciate how big the world really was. And over time, this would help standardize the Roman understanding of the world, how its lands and oceans worked, and facilitate orientation and long-distance travel, spurring new inventions and innovations like the compass much earlier than expected, especially with the mathematical revolution I would have brought with the Indian number system and other contributions like basic modern geometric calculations. Above all of that, thanks to the printing press and literacy rate of new generations, standardizing Latin or Greek among most of Roman citizens and non-citizens in the empire, I would start to create a nationalistic identity of pride and camaraderie among all the Romans in the empire, making them feel they are all brothers of the greatest civilization the world has ever seen, promoting my love and respect for Rome's history and legacy. Thanks to my hindsight, I would just know how important and precious in retrospective Rome's legacy will be in the future, teaching to their people how lucky they are to live in such a beautiful era in human civilization's history, showing them admiration, respect, and caring from me, traveling every time I could, interacting with lower classes and poor people, spending time with them, talking with them, eating with them in their houses, asking them how they felt, what do they need, what can I do to improve their life, showing them that I'm accessible and an emperor present for all his people. I would basically express my Romaboo love as a crazy fanatic of those people and culture, and while they would really appreciate it, I also think that they would sometimes think I'm being a bit too extreme or a bit over the top with my enthusiasm and happiness. My excitement and enthusiasm about everything, place, or person I would visit in the empire would be seen as cringe, naive, even childish, not being able to value and appreciate in the same way as me everything that was Roman. Yes, the Romans were very proud of their culture and deeply convinced that they were the greatest civilization in the world. And I mean, who can blame them for thinking that when it's actually true? But I also think that there was a certain complacency on the part of those same Romans who had reached the height of their civilization and history. To make my explanation more clear, I'm going to make a comparison with the boomers and the era in which they lived. Boomers always considered the era they lived in to be natural and normal. They grew up in a world full of opportunities and possibilities, with access to success for even the most humble classes that had never been seen before in history. I dare say that for the first time since the Pax Romana, the post-World War II era, was the best time in human history to be alive by far. But of course, none of this was considered abnormal, an anomaly that would only occur for one generation, and as those of us who are younger know so well today, the boomers failed to appreciate or be grateful for having been born in such a privileged time for their generation, with the new generations being the only ones who, in retrospect, are beginning to value those times we never lived. And that is sadly a very famous characteristic of humans. We only value how precious something was once we've lost it, but not while we had it. And I think the vibe would be similar for the Romans of the Pax Romana. They would consider the era they lived in to be the natural order of things, that it was simply normal to live in the greatest, most advanced, and most powerful civilization in human history up to that point, and that absolutely nothing could change that fact, taking it as completely acquired and normalized. Only after that glorious era of the 5 good emperors would the Romans begin to value those glorious days of the Pax Romana that Augustus had initiated. But in my case, my hindsight would make me value that time enormously, a time when everything was possible, when it was still possible to believe in excellence, when Rome would continue to grow eternally as the civilization destined to rule the world, being able to appreciate its qualities, virtues, beauty, art, and people, as none of them could do, valuing so many things about them that they would not even be able to realize, and how they were so much ahead of their time, as we all know in retrospect today. And with all of that, I hope that by the time of my death, in addition to having conditioned Marcus Aurelius to make wiser decisions about his offspring and successor as emperor, because yes, Marcus Aurelius would be the next emperor after me, but do not doubt that I would have prepared him all his life to make better decisions about his succession than the ones he made in our timeline, adopting reforms to the imperial succession system that would encourage access to that position as something of pure political or military merit, but in any case, of the appreciation and respect of both the Roman people and government. I would hope that the memory of my reign would be viewed positively by everyone, and that they will remember me as an example to follow in the right direction, and to never forget the ideals and values that got them to where they are in the first place. Personally, I think I would have been seen as an exceptional and highly competent emperor, creative and imaginative for all the innovations and reforms I would have brought to the empire, although on a personal level, I might have seemed strange, eccentric, too romantic, too emotional, or too effeminate maybe for the standards of that time, since I would have still been a product of my modern era I was born in after all. But despite my eccentricities for them, and despite my sometimes cringe enthusiasm for everything that had to do with Rome at times, that, in the end, I would be remembered as a reforming emperor who had shown the way to the Romans, the way of showing them that no, they had not reached their peak yet, that there was still much to discover, and that if they did not let their guard down and continued striving to build great legacies like those of their ancestors, the Romans would eventually achieve feats worthy of the gods of their mythologies. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. I hope all of you guys enjoyed that crazy isekai type of scenario of me being emperor. I'd like to know in the comments what you think about how the Romans would view me in that alternate timeline. Would I be seen as a good emperor and a good man? Or a weird cringe guy and effeminate nerd? Let me know your opinions on the subject. Honestly, there are many more topics I would have liked to present and discuss about what I would have done as emperor, but if I had gone into all the aspects of me being emperor and all the ideas I would have contributed to Roman society, the video would have lasted multiple hours, a luxury that at the moment I still cannot afford if I want to upload a video each week for you guys, but still, I hope you like the result. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. Thank you to the first members of my channel, shout out to you guys, and I deeply appreciate your support of my work and projects to come. And without anything else to say, see you next time.